Welcome, students of Paul, to another one of the video lectures. And this one is on the Roman context for Paul. Let's just go back to that intro to the Roman context for Paul and his letters. So we've talked about the Greek context for Paul, and we'll be talking about the temple context, the religious context, and the so-called parties in the first century. But this is about the Roman context for Paul and his letters. As we talked about, Paul was an individual who was a Jewish, a pious, Torah-abiding Jew who lived within a Greek-speaking culture, a Hellenic culture within the Roman Empire. Those are the overlapping layers of identity in which Paul lived. And so let's talk a bit more about that Roman Empire. First century Eastern Mediterranean culture, it was an imperial world where Rome extracted wealth and provided security for travel and commerce. It's important to note that Paul lived in an imperial world. The Roman Empire had become an empire not that long before Paul's life and work. The Roman Empire expanded in part by taxing, taking over and taxing areas heavily. And that was what supported the capital and supported its expansion and its troops. Imperial religion went along with imperial culture and military. So the emperor, there was a form of emperor worship that was still fairly rudimentary in Paul's day, formal recognition of the emperor or his genius as divine, usually after his death, but not always. In the first century, the Roman emperors started to move from divinizing their fathers to being divinized or being recognized as divine in their own lives and demanding worship in some way or recognition of that. The empire, with its symbols and its religious, cultural, military, and economic demands, influenced every part of Paul's life and work. Paul was born, grew up, worshipped, lived, did his mission work, and died, all affected heavily by the Roman Empire in which he lived, as was everyone else around the Mediterranean in that time. The Romans. I hope I can move myself out of the way of that statue. Let's see. The Roman Republic under General Pompey occupied Israel in 63 BCE, dismantled it into Judea and the Galilee, those two areas that become so important when we talk about Jesus being from the Galilee and traveling to Jerusalem and Judea, making the Jewish state a vassal state and taking away the rest of the country. So when the Romans took over officially in 63 BCE, excuse me, they dismantled the territory that had been Israel and Judea and made it a much smaller physical state. This officially and finally ended the relatively brief period of Jewish independence. However, Judeans and Galileans in the first century remembered a time when they were independent, and that's important for the later rebellion against Rome. Most Jews lived in the diaspora. Now, what's the diaspora? The diaspora is a scattered population of people, usually scattered by oppression, living outside their geographic homeland. So most Jews in the first century lived outside of Israel, spread throughout the empire, and Paul was certainly an example of that. Diaspora Jews looked to Jerusalem as the center of their faith, but they didn't or couldn't necessarily go there often, even though Second Temple Judaism was a pilgrimage faith, meaning that if you could, you were to travel to Jerusalem for one of the festivals at some point. You were commanded to do that, in fact, in Deuteronomy. But many diaspora Jews couldn't or didn't necessarily get to Jerusalem very often for many reasons, nor did they share Judean language or culture. So Paul was an example. Even though he was Jewish, even though Paul was Jewish, he spoke and wrote and thought in Greek and identified with cities that were not in Israel, in Judea. The Roman conquest of Judea in 63 BCE, the Romans were invited in by various groups who were arguing over the political control of Judea. They were invited in to resolve an internal dispute, and as Romans were wont to do, they used it as an opportunity to solidify their hold on the property and to take control. Now, here is a rather large text. What I'm going to do is I'm going to ask you to stop the video, or pause the video, I should say, and read this text, which is by Josephus from his work, The Antiquities of the Jews. Josephus wrote this at the very end of the first century. it's a rather long section, but I'd like you to take special note of the parts that I've highlighted. The Romans occupied Judea. So this is about Pompey's taking over of Jerusalem. And I'd like you to read this and the next slide. So pause it, move to the next slide, read these two slides, which are a primary source, an original source, and then we're going to talk about them. So thank you, and I'll see you in a couple of slides. All right, welcome back. What I would like you to do now is to take a look at these questions. Josephus, the historian who wrote this passage, had been a Jewish general in the rebellion against the Romans in 66 to 70 of the Common Era, who defected to the Romans and was adopted into the family of the Caesar. And what I'd like to do is that I'd like to talk about the slides before, which are not about the rebellion from 66 to 70, but are about the earlier Roman takeover in 63 BCE of Jerusalem and of Judea. In the text that he wrote about 63 BCE, about the previous century, was he positive toward the Romans or negative? I'd like you to answer that, in your opinion, reading those texts. The second question, what did Pompey do that for any Jew, even Josephus, should not have been done? Answer that question, if you would, please, and be ready to come to our meeting and talk about it. Question number 3, as far as you can tell, did the Romans take away Jewish worship in the temple or harm the temple in any physical way, judging from that text that you've read? And finally, what was the result of the Roman takeover in terms of money and land for the Jews in economics and territory for the Jews in Judea? So please take a moment, answer those questions on a sheet of paper or something that you can bring with you to our meeting. And then when you're ready, move to the next slide. Here's a slide of the Roman political divisions around Judea in the first century. So at the time of Jesus and at the time of Paul, here is what the area looked like. And Roman affairs, one of the most important things to note is that Roman affairs in Judea and Galilee were directed from the regional capital in Syria. And so the whole area was, which I think there's my little, you should be able to see my little arrow. This whole area was basically directed by the Romans from Syria, which is up in here, from near Damascus. And it should be right up in this area. The Jewish area sat near Rome's troubled border with Parthia, Persia, and its intrigues. So what does that mean? Part of the reason that the Romans were interested in Judea and so interested in this area is that it was a border region with a rival political empire, the Persians. And so the Romans were very much interested in what was going on. Another thing that you can see here is that you see the area, this is a class about Paul and not Jesus, but I do want to show you that the area of the Galilee up here was administered by the Romans, and the area of Judea down here, but Samaria had been sort of cut off by the Romans from the Israeli state, or the Israelite state, the Judea state, I should say. And also that there were a number of cities that were established, which were Greek cities. And so the interpenetration, the sort of mix of Greek culture and Jewish life was really complete, even in this area. And Paul, of course, comes from a completely different area, although the temple is here and the Jewish homeland is here, and Jerusalem is here. Paul comes from the wider Mediterranean Greek-speaking world. Okay, Herod's Temple. Herod the Great, who reigned from 37 to 4 BCE, was a client king of the Romans. So one of the things that the Romans did was to install a client king. It was easier for them to deal through somebody, let somebody else deal with the trouble, and simply send the money to Rome. And so the Romans gave Herod the Great the right and responsibility of running Jerusalem, and he had to lay siege to Jerusalem to actually take it over himself with Roman help. He was thoroughly Hellenized, meaning that that he was culturally Greek and that he spoke Greek, but he played up his Jewish piety for politics' sake. Under Herod the Great, the Second Temple was expanded and became one of the wonders of the ancient world. And this is where Jesus, Paul, and the first Jesus followers would have walked. And this is a model of what the temple would have looked like. When Paul writes, "Your body is a temple of the Holy Spirit," in Corinthians, this temple is likely in his mind. And this is the temple that was then first was entered by Pompey in 63 BCE when he captured Jerusalem. But in 70 CE, so that is 130 odd years later, it was destroyed by the Romans at the end of the Jewish rebellion against Rome that we're going to be talking about. Okay, so what were these troubles? Political troubles of the first century in Judea and Palestine. When Herod the Great died, his kingdom was split up by the Romans and the southern part put under direct Roman military occupation. They simply could not find somebody who could handle Jerusalem and the area. And so it became a Roman governor. And you will have heard perhaps the name Pontius Pilate. And he was the procurator, the governor of this area for a time. Roman governors lived on the coast at Caesarea Maritima and went to Jerusalem for the festivals because that was the time when there was most likely to be trouble. So they would take Roman troops and go up to Jerusalem, literally is up to Jerusalem, for the festivals in order to sort of police the festivals. The lifetime of Jesus and that of Paul correspond almost completely to this turbulent time of direct Roman rule in the south in Judea, around the area around Jerusalem. Religious and political messiahs abounded, according to Josephus, during this time. And this was part of the fraught time that the Romans, as an occupying force, dealt with. Apocalyptic fervor was in the air, and increasing Jewish unrest and Roman mismanagement and oppression, and also rapaciousness. The Romans simply were extracting an awful lot of wealth from the area, eventually led to the Jewish wars of revolt against Rome from 66 to 70 of the Common Era. So after Jesus' crucifixion and after Paul's death, very shortly after Paul's death, from 66 to 70, we have the Jewish wars of revolt against Rome, of rebellion, of resistance, and it ends in 70 with that ended in 70 with the destruction of the temple and of Jerusalem. Here is Caesarea Maritima. So this is where the Roman governors would have stayed on the coast. This is where Herod the Great stayed for much of the year, probably because it was cooler by the sea. And these are the ruins. I took this photo in 2009. But you can see the large amphitheater in the back, which still remains right by the seashore. This is right by the seashore. You can sit up here and look out over the Mediterranean, which would be much cooler than many other parts of Judea and the Galilee were. So the end of Jerusalem, what happened? From 66 to 70, rebellious Jews hoped to be successful as the Maccabees had been against Antiochus IV centuries earlier. Now, not all Jews revolted against Rome by any stretch, not even in Palestine, not even in Judea. The revolt had some initial success, especially in the Galilee, but was soon crushed under Vespasian and later his son Titus. And it was during that time that Josephus, who was a general and the historian that you read earlier, went over to the Roman side. It's a long story about that. That's very, very fascinating. Some of you may know. Titus destroyed Jerusalem, laid siege to Jerusalem, and eventually entered it, and the temple in 70. And the Roman troops pushed down even these massive, massive stones, the size of city buses, some of these blocks that made up the temple. And you can still see in Jerusalem where these stones hit the pavements below as they were pushed off the temple and cracked the pavements below. And the Wailing Wall, which you may have heard of or you may know, in Jerusalem is not actually part of the temple, but part of the foundation for Herod's Temple, which still stands. But the temple itself was pushed down completely and destroyed. And this ended between the Jewish homeland and Second Temple Judaism by the destruction of the temple. A subsequent second revolt, the Bar Kokhba revolt in around 125, hardened Roman resolve to turn Jerusalem into a completely non-Jewish city. For a time after that, the Romans simply forbade any Jew from entering what had been Jerusalem on pain of death and the Jewish kingdom. And it really solidified the Jewish diaspora, or the scattering of the Jews of that area all throughout the empire and beyond. Jewish groups throughout the Roman Mediterranean reacted in different ways to the revolts. Remember that most Jews, even before the revolts had started, lived outside of this area. They lived scattered throughout the Roman Empire already, and they reacted in different ways. But the loss of Judaism's temple meant Judaism's end as a sacrificing religion. That's an important point, because at that time, all religions sacrificed. Every religion, it was just part of being religious that you would sacrifice. But it ended Judaism as a sacrificing religion, and it solidified the move to synagogues as places of teaching and Torah. This marked the beginning of the permanent diaspora from Israel, which lasted until 1948 in the establishment of contemporary modern-day Israel. All right, let's keep going. Vespasian and Titus. Vespasian is the head on the left and Titus on the right. These are pictures that I took, I think, in the British Museum. And again, we have a text from Josephus. Now, this is Josephus. In the previous ones, Josephus was talking about the Roman takeover of Judea in 63 BCE, the Roman Republic's takeover in 63 BCE, before Jesus, before Paul, and how the Romans took control. Well, this text is from later on, and it talks about later on, it talks about the fall of Jerusalem at the end of the Jewish rebellion in the year 70, so 130 years later. And Josephus writes, "But when they went in numbers into the lanes of the city with their swords drawn, they slew those whom they overtook without mercy, and set fire to the houses, whither the Jews were fled, and burnt every soul in them, and laid waste a great many of the rest. And when they were come to the houses to plunder them, they found in them entire families of dead men, and the upper rooms full of dead corpses, that is, of such as died by the famine, because they had laid siege to Jerusalem for quite some time. They then stood in a horror at this sight, and went out without touching anything. But although they had this commiseration for such as were destroyed in that manner, yet had they not the same for those that were still alive, but they ran everyone through whom they met with, and obstructed the very lanes with their dead bodies, and made the whole city run down with blood, to such a degree indeed that the fire of many of the houses was quenched with these men's blood." So it was a terrible, terrible time for all of the Jews who were held up in Jerusalem. And Josephus makes the point that it wasn't that there was a lot of disagreement amongst the Jews in Jerusalem as to whether they should have been rebelling against the Romans, and to what extent, and whether they should have been making peace or not. But that they were, and in fact that there were pilgrims at the time also who were from other places who were sort of bottled up in Jerusalem by the rebellion, and that there was an awful lot of innocent suffering and death. Titus on the right was a son of Vespasian, and he was the one who finished, he was the Roman general who finished the campaign against Jerusalem, conquered Jerusalem, destroyed the temple, and then very shortly became emperor himself. Here is a picture I took in 2009 of the Temple Mount from the Mount of Olives across the way and across the valley. And you can see it's been built up again, and you have the Dome of the Rock, the Muslim shrine on the Temple Mount, what was once the Temple Mount, and the Wailing Wall is on the other side. But what's left is basically the foundation, Herod's foundations. The temple itself was destroyed by the Romans in 70. So the early Jesus movement, let's talk about that. The early Jesus movement was an apocalyptic eschatological movement. What does that mean? It means that Jesus himself believed and taught, as you can read in the Gospels, that the God of Israel would soon be back and would inaugurate a reign on earth, centered in Jerusalem at the temple, inaugurate a reign where God would be in charge. The God of Israel would be in charge of the whole world. And finally, the people of Israel would be proven and shown and vindicated as God's chosen people. Jesus was crucified in the year around the time 33. We don't know exactly, but around 33, something like that, Jesus was crucified. And then shortly after, his disciples saw visions of his resurrected body, and he spoke with them. They saw visions of his resurrection, including Paul, who is including himself amongst the witnesses of the resurrection. And Paul then travels out and particularly spreads this message to non-Jews, which very few of the other Jesus-following disciples had done. Paul especially goes to the non-Jews from 50 to about 64, so a decade and a little bit is where we have record from his letters. He was busy before that, certainly. And then we have the destruction of the temple by Titus's troops, and in 70, so very shortly after Paul's death, which I'm dating somewhere around 63, 64. Within about 6 years, we have the destruction of the temple. So this whole time of rebellion that leads up to the temple's destruction. And then we have the writing of the Gospels. And the writing of the Gospels begins with Mark. Mark is the oldest Gospel, we think. There are no dates on any of them, but we guess that Mark's is the oldest, around the time of the destruction, around 70. Matthew after that, Luke and Acts quite a bit after that, and John finally quite a bit after that as well. Now, why did the Gospels come after Paul's letters? Because remember that I said that it's an apocalyptic eschatological movement. If Jesus is returning as Messiah in your lifetime, do you need to write down his biography in a gospel to pass on to future generations of Jesus followers? No, of course not, because God's reign will come in your lifetime. It was only after the destruction of the temple, it was only after the death of many of the eyewitnesses, the disciples who had been around Jesus, that people in the movement started to realize that perhaps they needed to write things down. And this is when Mark writes the first gospel, or the first canonical gospel at least. And when we start to get these records of Jesus' life and teachings. And then the book of Revelation, finally, written around the year 100. And so this event, the destruction of the temple in the year 70, is really, really a crucial moment for everything that follows. I call it a cataclysm. It was like it changed the world. Now, did it seem that way for everyone in the year 70 when it happened? I'm not sure, but it certainly changed the world for everything that followed for us. And that is because Second Temple Judaism really ended with the destruction of the temple, or shortly after. And all of the religious environment of that first century of the Second Temple really moved in quite different directions. Firstly, into rabbinic Judaism. So the Pharisees, what had been the Pharisees who had taught in the first century and had a very long history of teaching Torah, they sort of evolved into rabbinic Judaism, and the Jesus movement evolved out of this period of time as well. So there are really these sort of two children of Second Temple Judaism, more than that, but these two major children of Second Temple Judaism. And the Jesus movement became increasingly non-Jewish, and rabbinic Judaism became increasingly, was always Jewish and remained so. The second century, following Paul, this is a picture, by the way, on the right that I took at the Church of St. James, which is very close to Concordia's downtown campus, right beside it, in fact. The second century, the century following Paul, with the destruction of Jerusalem came a shock. In the centuries of turmoil that followed, two successor movements emerged, as I just said, rabbinic Judaism and early Christianity, but they both came out of this matrix of Second Temple Judaism. We need to remember that Paul was Jewish, and that the Jesus movement was a Jewish movement, and that it was always Jewish. It's Jewish in its roots, in its teachings, in its eschatological expectation. It was the God of Israel who would vindicate the Jews as God's chosen people in the end time. As rabbinic Judaism and proto-Orthodox Christianity, increasingly non-Jewish, established themselves, each closed their canon of scriptures, that is, their collection or set of what was authoritative for them, and hereticized the other. I'm not sure if that's a real verb, but what I mean by that is that they each sort of put up fences against the other in ways that created this concept eventually of religion. Eventually came the closing of the Jewish scriptures, the rupture of Judaism with Christianity, and the rush of Christianity towards its own scriptures. We just talked about the writing of the Gospels, the book of Revelation, and so on. In proto-Orthodox Christianity, and by that I mean earliest Christianity, the delay of Jesus's presumed return, or the parousia, Jesus taught that he would be returning as the Messiah, according to the Gospels, and the written Gospels written much later. And Paul certainly talks about the Christ returning as Messiah. And the death of the eyewitnesses precipitated the writing of the Gospels and the other documents. Paul's letters were the very first Christian writings that were collected in a set together. already by the end of the first century, by the 90s. They were collected together. The second century, that is from 100 to 200 of our era, of Common Era, was the most formative for the movement that came to be Christianity and for the shape that the New Testament eventually took. And Paul's place within that New Testament is such an important part of it. 13 out of 27 books have Paul's name attached to them. Christianity became more and more patriarchal over this period of time from 100 to 200 and far more Roman. And all of those changes really modified the message of Christianity and also gave a different lens to how we interpret Paul. By the 5th century, Paul is considered to be a Roman martyr. It's almost forgotten that he was Jewish, and that he lived, worked, and died as a Jewish prophet of the Jesus movement, who was particularly concerned with non-Jews, with what he called Gentiles, but was very much Jewish working within this Jewish movement in the 1st century. But by the 5th century, much of that is forgotten. Paul is claimed as a Roman martyr. And it's hard to tell if images like this one on the left, which is from a Roman villa, actually in what had been at the time Britain, a Roman villa in Roman Britain. It's hard to tell. Some people say this is one of the earliest mosaics that's portraying Jesus, because there's a Chi Rho in the mosaic behind him, a Christian symbol. But we can't quite tell if it's Jesus or if it's a Roman god, because they were depicting Jesus as a Roman god already by the 5th century. So what have we got in the grand sweep of Roman influence? You have the Romans moving in to Judea a century or more before Paul and Jesus lived, taking control, and that's what Pompey marching in was. And you have the Romans then establishing economic, political, and cultural control, reinforcing the Greek cultural context, but establishing this military and economic empire, which so much affected both Jesus and Paul. And then when Jesus and Paul lived, Jesus lived within this occupied territory. Paul lived within the larger empire, but looked toward the temple in Jerusalem. And then there was the Jewish rebellion and the destruction of the temple and of much of Jerusalem in the year 70, which changed the whole nature of Judaism and changed what had just been going on in the Jesus movement, which was a part of Judaism. And then over the next couple of centuries, Christianity becomes more and more something distinct from its Jewish roots and teachings, and becomes more and more Roman and more patriarchal, and further and further divorced from this original 1st century context. So this is partly why it's important to know this Roman context for Paul. And then eventually it becomes, by the 5th century, it becomes the official religion of the empire, Christianity. All right. So thank you for this, and we will, I look forward to talking to you and with you about some of these questions that we had, that I've outlined in this text. All right. See you soon.